Risk Management and Education Grants Program, the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, and Northeast SARE. So welcome to the first webinar in this series, and the goal of these webinars are to provide you practical in-season cover crop information. And our first presenter in the series is Bill Curran from Penn State University, and he's going to be talking about herbicide programs for interseeding cover crops. So welcome, Bill, and thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I appreciate being invited to kick this thing off, and so I'm going to talk about cover crops and mostly corn herbicides, sort of a big issue and probably very timely right now as we move into corn planting season. I've been involved in doing a fair amount of research looking at herbicide programs and how they might impact cover crops, and I'm going to really focus on two things today. One is the idea that we're planting cover crops post-harvest, so we're growing corn, and I say mostly corn, but there could be other possibilities there. And then we're trying to establish a cover crop after corn harvest. And then the other is I was asked to talk a little bit about herbicide programs when we interseed cover crops, and a number of us are involved in interseeding cover crops, mostly again in corn, and so I'll touch on some of that work and what we're seeing. I think I don't need to sort of elaborate on the value of cover crops. I know if you're on this program today, you're pretty jazzed about integrating cover crops. So mostly we're discussing what we call residual herbicides, and so these are herbicides that are active in the soil. Usually they're soil applied, so usually you apply them at planting time or near planting time. Sometimes they can be applied post-emergence too. And generally they provide somewhere between 8 and 12 weeks of weed control. So these are products that basically kill germinating seedlings. So as the seeds germinate, they imbibe the herbicide and kill that little weed. Obviously we're hopeful that they don't impact our cash crop, and for the most part they don't. There's a term that I'm going to use called half-life. And I'm going to get back to this, but that's really how long does the herbicide last in the environment or in the soil. And so if it doesn't last very long at all, that can be problematic because we don't get good weed control, and we might have reduced performance. But if it lasts too long, then we use this term carryover, and it lasts too long and it carries over and can injure the subsequent crop that we're interested in growing. And of course interseeded cover crops are particularly vulnerable because we're really coming in 5 to 7 weeks after we plant, so we're oftentimes in that window, that 8 to 12 week window, when a lot of these products are still active, and so we be wasting time and money if we choose the wrong herbicide. Products dissipate or degrade from our soils in different ways, and it really is dependent upon the individual active ingredient. Some things are very short-lived, and some things can last a long time. Fortunately, in most of our cash crops, we don't use the really long-lived products because of rotational restrictions. But if anybody's ever been involved in weed control on rights-of-way, railroad tracks, power lines, things like that, they're using products that might last 2 or 3 years. And so it's really important to sort of get a handle on what you're using and how long does it last, because really what we don't want is to see something like this where a herbicide, this happened to be a corn herbicide that was then planted to wheat that next fall or after corn harvest, and lo and behold we had some problems. So really there's two things that I'm going to sort of focus on here. The first one is how long does the herbicide last, how persistent is it in the soil, and we're going to talk about half-lives sort of to discuss that. And then the second thing though is how sensitive are our rotational crops. And so if you plant a crop that's not sensitive, then it really doesn't matter how long it lasts. But if you plant things that are very sensitive, and unfortunately many of our cover crops, particularly small seeded legumes, brassicas like radish and some of the other mustards can be quite sensitive. And it's important to note that last point is that persistent herbicides that aren't very active don't really matter. And then short-lived herbicides that are very active don't really matter. So it's really sort of these products maybe that are in between, things that are somewhat persistent and have a lot of soil activity. So one of the things that I'll talk about is where do I find information about rotation restrictions? And most herbicide labels, well, all herbicide labels have rotation restrictions on them for major cash crops. The problem becomes that many of them don't cover minor cash crops, which is what I would include the cover crop category in, and oftentimes they'll have an other category, sort of things that either they haven't looked at or just are not used widely enough to justify doing some research to see whether they're very sensitive. And it's important also to remember that there's two reasons why we have recrop restrictions. Mostly what I'm discussing today is this first one. We're concerned about carryover residues that could injure rotational crops, and that's particularly true for the cover crop scenario. But the other is that there is concern for herbicide residues within those rotational crops. If the herbicide's not labeled on the crop, and you were to sample that crop and test it for herbicides, and you found certain herbicides in those residues, that would be considered illegal in terms of food, feed, and forage. So it's a little bit of a gray area. If we're not feeding our cover crops, then we're really just concerned about number one there, the carryover residue issue. But if we're grazing, for example, a cover crop, then it becomes a little bit sticky in terms of what we need to consider, because there's a lot of herbicides that would not allow cover crops to be planted after harvest because of residues, or the concern for residues. So I'm not going to really touch on that too much more today. I'm really focused more on the residue, the carryover residue thing. I want to make sure I introduce this. It's a new guide that a group of us launched this year. It's the MidAtlantic Field Crop Weed Management Guide. It's based here at Penn State, but actually my colleagues from the South are also involved in it, and this is a weed guide that's available in hard copy and electronically. And you can see the website down below. It's going to be updated annually. So if you're looking for the latest in weed control information, I'll point you here. And I'm using it because I have some tables that we have in here, and this is sort of the classic table. This is our herbicide rotational restrictions for cash crops, and I know it's small, and hopefully you can see this, but I was just going to point out, for example, Kalista, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, Kalista or mesotrione, a corn herbicide, and it's in a lot of different products now. This is the sort of information you can find in this guide, and certainly other states have similar guides. But you can see Kalista has some pretty restrictive time intervals, rotational crop intervals for certain things. So things like clover, 18 months. So this is a good place to find, at least a first place to find information about rotational restrictions. And this is information that's on the labels. So if we went to a Kalista label, we would find this is basically from the Kalista label that certain crops that it's labeled on, you can plant those anytime. Those are the immediate ones. It does have small grains, so a rye cover crop would be considered in that 120-day category. If you wanted to plant canola, say some folks are interested in canola or rape as a cover crop, 10 months for that. And then you see all this group of things that are pretty sensitive to mesotrione, which would include the clovers, red clover anyway, which has an 18-month rotational restriction. So this is an example of a product that we do need to have some concern for. So what I will tell folks is, if possible, look for products that have less than or equal to a 4-month rotation restriction. That's kind of our timeline. If we're thinking about trying to plant a cover crop after cash crop harvest in the fall, anything that is 4 months or less, you're pretty well good to go. If you look at our guide that I just showed you, you can see some of the things that are labeled that would be considered potential cover crops. The problem is where you have things that are not listed, and so as an example, you have hairy vetch is a more obscure legume, and you're almost never going to find hairy vetch on a recrop table for a label. And so what I will often tell people is think about close relatives of that species. So hairy vetch is a legume, and so you could somewhat think, well, look at the alfalfa and the clover restrictions, and then maybe I can get a pretty good idea of what the potential for injury is with that legume. Others, forage radish would be a good example. You're never going to find forage radish on a label. Buckwheat, surprisingly, is often in that other category. So these can be difficult. And as a general rule, small seeded species, legumes, small grasses, small seeded grasses, brassicas, those tend to be the most sensitive. The bigger seeded things, peas, actually hairy vetch is a little larger seed. Those tend to be a little more tolerant, and they can make it through some of these things that smaller seeded species can't. So I'm going to come back to this slide and talk a little bit more about persistence and sensitivity or susceptibility. I mentioned this term half-life, and that's something that I've sort of focused in on with some of my extension talks and also some of the demonstrations that we do. And so a half-life, by definition, is the amount of time that it takes for a herbicide to degrade to half the amount that was originally present. And so if we look at this graph, and I'm going to use this this pointer here. At time 0, we have 100% of the herbicide. At 1 half-life, 50% of it is remaining. At 2 half-lives, 25% of it is remaining. At 3 half-lives, 12.5% of it is remaining. So basically, you're going down by half for each half-life. And so, as an example, 2,4-D, which I think you're probably all familiar with, 2,4-D is a short-lived herbicide. It has a half-life of about 7 days. And so you can see that if you applied a pint of 2,4-D in 7 days, you have a half a pint. In 14 days, you got a quarter pint, an eighth of a pint, a 16th of a pint, etc. So basically, within 30 days of applying 2,4-D, it's pretty much gone, and is not really a concern in recropping too many things. One that is or can be a problem is atrazine. So atrazine has a half-life. These are sort of book values. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Half-life of 60 days, so 2 months. So much different than 7 days. So if you apply a pound of atrazine or a quart of atrazine, it might be a couple of months before you're down to half that amount, and then 2 more months before you're down to half that amount. So you can, if you use atrazine in corn and you're planting some crop that's sensitive to it, 120 days later, you've only gone through 2 half-lives, and so you could have potential for injury with a product that has that long a half-life. So I sort of have these general categories. Things that are fairly short-lived have half-lives of 30 days or less. Sort of the intermediate things, 30 to 120 days, and then long-lived things more than 120 days. And I mentioned this at the beginning, that we don't really use any long half-life materials in agriculture because of rotations. But there are a number of intermediate, there are a number of products that are in that intermediate category, and so those are the ones that really we need to be thinking about. And so there is a fair amount of information about half-lives in the literature. Think about it when companies register materials and they have to re-register these materials with EPA, they have to provide half-life information. And so usually there are field and lab studies that have been done over time. Newer products, I would say probably we have better information for those. Some of the older things, older products, and now some of the generic things, probably even though they've been around a long time, maybe that data is old and is not as recent. But so these are some half-lives for some of the common herbicides that we use, and you can see there's the atrazine, and you see some that have a range, and so that's the other thing to keep in mind, that and some of these are quite large ranges. That really depends on the environment, the soil type, rainfall, soil pH, texture, those sorts of things. That all influences how quickly these things dissipate. But again, if it's short, then it's not going to last long. If it's intermediate or long, then those are the ones that tend to be sort of a moving target. And so we can sort of categorize these, and these are sort of my arbitrary categories. Things that last more than 4 months. These are the things that half-lives for more than 4 months. These are the things that I would be concerned about with cover crops. The 2 to 4 month, those would be sort of our intermediate category. Sometimes we could have problems, but I would say most of the time, certainly for fall cover crop establishment after corn harvest, we're usually okay with those. And then products that don't last very long, less than 2 months, that we would very rarely ever see any issue with carryover injury. So the other part of that, so half-life, how long it lasts, is the first thing, and then the second one is how sensitive is the crop that I'm planting. And so we can look at some examples. Atrazine is very active on small seeded broadleaves, right? It's a great broadleaf herbicide, and so things like alfalfa and the clovers, radish, I would say canola is right in there too. Those are going to be the most sensitive things. Less active on grasses and less active on large seeded things, and so the ones that usually are okay would be the small grains, although occasionally we'll have problems with small grain carryover injury. It's fairly rare in our region anyway. Mesotrione, that's our Kalista, very active on small seeded legumes, brassicas. Doesn't really have any grass activity, so you could plant a grass. You could use mesotrione or Kalista with and plant grasses. It's labeled on corn as an example. And then I have one soybean herbicide, chlorimiron. This is the active ingredient in a number of products. Classic is the trade name for the single active ingredient. It's a DuPont herbicide. And again, you see a trend here. Small seeded legumes, brassicas. Those tend to be the ones that are most sensitive to a lot of these more problematic products. So the other table that we've included in the guide, and I've had this table actually on our website, and this is sort of where we are with this. It's corn herbicide half-lives and their potential to injure fall established cover crops. So this is focused on post-harvest establishment. And so the first one on that list, 2,4-D, the normal application rate. There's the half-life, 7 days. And then fall established cover crops. Well, grasses are fine to plant. And really with 2,4-D, if you wait 30 days, you can plant anything. It's gone. If you scroll down a little bit, you see Callisto that we've talked about, which is an active ingredient in Lumax, Lexar, Helix GT, Instigate, Realm Q. There's a bunch of products now that have this mesotrione in them. And I have here a range of the half-life between 10 and 50. It's a bit of a moving target. It's not active on grasses, so you can plant any grass, but small seeded legumes and mustards are problematic for a product that contains mesotrione. So this is just a snapshot of what that table has. So we have the tables have corn and soybean products basically. So sort of some general guidelines that I mentioned. Look at half-life information, which is available more now. There are some key products to think about. With corn, it's atrazine and simazine or Princep. If you're less than a pound per acre, usually not a problem for cereal grain establishment. If I'm thinking about legumes, though, I'd want to be less than 3/4 of a pound per acre. Mesotrione, we know, is problematic for legumes and mustards. Clopyralid, this is the active ingredient in Stinger, a component of Hornet, Sure Start, several other products. This is quite active on small-seeded broadleaves. Then I mentioned just a few soybean herbicides that I had an example with chlorimiron, but some others that can be problematic depending on what you're doing. So that's the first part. I'm going to finish up because we do want to leave time for questions, talking a little bit about herbicides and interseeding. We developed an interseeder here 5 or 6 years ago. Heather Darby's been evaluating this in Vermont. There's a number of them now around the country, and folks are interested in this. And so the herbicide picture with this can be problematic. And what we're mostly doing here is we're interseeding cover crops at V5 to V7 corn. You know, they're hanging out under the canopy, and the idea is that when we harvest that crop, we have a nice cover crop already established. And here's one of Heather's plots from a few years ago, and so it's been pretty successful. Most of the research that we've been doing, we tend to use Roundup Ready corn, and we rely pretty heavily on Roundup or glyphosate, and so that this is not a sustainable practice. We really need to think about other herbicide programs, and so we've been trying to do some research looking at herbicides, and John Wallace is a postdoc that I work with, and we've had trials at a number of locations now. And certainly if you choose the wrong herbicide, you can have dramatic impacts on the cover crop. There's no point in interseeding. As an example here, using dual and you're interseeding ryegrass, it's a big no-no. So we had trials at about 10 locations over the last 3 years. We're continuing this work. Most of this is work that's happened in Pennsylvania, but also in Maryland and up in New York with some collaborators at Cornell. The products that we focused on have been some of the chief broadleaf products, and mostly we're focused on products that we think could work or ones that we know could be a problem. So that's why you see mesotrione there. And then we've also looked at grass control products, things like the dual Outlook harness, prowl, those kinds of things. And we've looked at various rates. And so I'm going to go through these figures. They're a little bit complicated pretty quickly, but we tend to focus on 2 species. Red clover is our broadleaf, and annual ryegrass is our grass. And this shows, this is actually the results over 6 locations. These are the broadleaf herbicides. Ceflufinicil is Sharpen, rimsulfuron is Resolve, mesotrione, Kalista, and then of course atrazine. And this middle line is the control. So if it's on that line, then it's no difference from the control. If it's left of the control, then it hurt the cover crop. And so, for example, mesotrione killed about 70% of the red clover. That's what that number is. And those lines are basically, that's the variability, the sort of a confidence interval around those data. And so it can be quite variable based on the location. But so if anything's to the left, that means it could be a problem. If it's in the middle, it's okay, and sometimes things are on the right. So these are the broadleaf herbicides on red clover, and you can see mesotrione really stands out. Atrazine also looks to be a problem. Here's the grass herbicides. So dimethenamid is Outlook, Harness, Dual, and Prowl. And for the most part, you can use grass herbicides and get away with clover. Is what this is telling us. You know, with maybe some exceptions. The metolachlor was a little harder on it. And then we've tended to look at combinations because nobody's using individual products. And so here we're thinking about using reduced rates, half to 2/3 of the normal rate at planting time, and then still coming in with glyphosate. You could use Liberty Link, Liberty, maybe some other post products. And so half rates of these combination products, Lumax, Verdict, Keystone, and the one that really stands out here is the Lumax because again the mesotrione and atrazine really nailing the red clover. Similar sort of graph for ryegrass, and again broadleaf herbicides pretty safe on ryegrass for the most part. So that's what that's telling you. But the grass herbicides can be a problem, and Dual sort of stands out. We have had some better success with Outlook and Harness, actually. Those don't last as long. And then the combinations of materials. And so we've tried to boil this down, and I'm going to go through this pretty quick, sort of some of a summary, and we are working on a table that I'll show you right here. And so these are the herbicides we've been testing. At the top you have annual ryegrass, red clover, and then mixtures. If it's green, it works pretty well. If it's yellow, it's sort of caution, and you know the pink or red is watch out, don't use it. Those are like percent reduction numbers. So for annual ryegrass, red clover, quite a few products working on red clover pretty well. The challenge comes when we start mixing species together. Then all of a sudden our options become fewer. So if we're using grasses or legumes you have more options, but when you start mixing cover crop species, pretty soon it becomes a bit more challenging. So this is a table that's a work in progress, and we will develop this further and try to get it out as an extension piece. I want to stop there and see if there's any questions. I know we're about
perfect timing.
To run long.
No, perfect timing, Bill. Thank you so much. Before we go over to the question and answer period, I just wanted to give a couple of quick poll questions for our audience here. So I'm going to launch these polls. You're going to see a question pop up on your screen. You're just going to answer, click on one of those responses. So did you learn anything new today? If you could just click on one of those responses, we'll rush right through these so we can get to the question and answer period. So you're just going to click on your screen to answer one of those questions. Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'm going to close this one, and let's go to the next one. Here we go. As a result of what you learned, will you make a change on your farm, or how you advise farmers? If you could just click on one of those responses, that would be fabulous. Great. Thank you very much. Okay. Awesome. Okay, so to pose a question to Bill, what you're going to do is you're going to find the question box, which is on the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you're on a mobile device, you'll find the question mark to open it up. Just going to type your question in, and I will read it out loud to Bill. We have about 3 minutes of Q&A. This is the first time we've offered this webinar series. Wanted to have them really quick and to the point, which Bill did a great job. But it doesn't leave a whole time for questions. So I'm just looking at the question pod right now, and I'm not seeing any. Does anyone have any questions for Bill?
I would also say, feel free. My email is wcurran@psu.edu.
Great.
You can reach me at 814-863-1014 if you have questions and want to talk in person.
Okay. Well, I'm still seeing no questions in the question pod.
Well, maybe I'll launch into my next presentation then.
another 30 minutes.
Exactly.
No, that was really great. It was really great. We've been having a lot of questions about this on this particular topic, so I really appreciate your time. And I guess if folks don't have any questions, we're going to wish you a great rest of the day. And as a reminder, this is the first part of a 5-part series. Next week we have Heather Darby. She's going to be talking about termination options and pros and cons of each termination option. And we have a lot of great speakers, including Bill, on our lineup. And for those who might have caught, we're kind of playing off this morning coffee break sort of concept. So if folks attend all 5 of the webinars, we're going to send you a free coffee card, gift certificate for coffee. So that should maybe provide some extra incentive to tune in every week. And I guess with that, I'm not seeing any questions, so I'd like to wish you all a good day. And Bill, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, enjoyed it. Thanks, Deb.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.